At the dawn of the 16th century, Spain stood as one of the greatest powers the world had ever known. Its empire stretched across the globe, its armies were formidable, and its wealth seemed limitless. The Spanish crown was at the peak of its glory, ruling vast territories in the Americas, Europe, and beyond. But behind the glittering facade of empire, the first cracks were beginning to form. To understand why the wealthiest empire in history eventually crumbled into poverty, we must look back at the early 1500s. Spain's dominance was built on its colonial conquests, particularly in the Americas. The discovery of vast amounts of gold and silver in the New World made Spain the richest country in Europe. The Spanish Empire's coffers were brimming with treasure. Spanish conquistadors, such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, had toppled mighty empires like the Aztecs and the Incas, sending enormous quantities of precious metals back to Spain. For a time, Spain's wealth seemed endless, fueling the belief that the empire was invincible. However, this wealth came at a cost. Spain's empire was vast and sprawling, requiring an enormous amount of resources to maintain. The Spanish crown's military expenses were sky high. Its wars with France, England, and the Dutch took a significant toll on the country's finances. And despite the wealth flowing from the colonies, Spain lacked the financial infrastructure to manage it effectively. Its tax system was archaic and inefficient, relying on a system of regressive taxes that placed an enormous burden on the poor. Spain's wealth was also an illusion. Much of the gold and silver it acquired from the Americas was not invested in productive enterprises. Instead, it was squandered on wars, lavish palaces, and the extravagant lifestyles of the Spanish aristocracy. The crown, constantly in need of funds, turned to borrowing. Spain became heavily indebted to foreign banks, including the very institutions that funded its wars. The kingdom found itself trapped in a cycle of debt, borrowing to pay off old loans, only to find itself deeper in financial trouble. By the late 16th century, Spain's imperial expansion had reached its peak, but it was already beginning to falter. The empire was stretched thin, with colonies in the Americas, Europe, and Asia all requiring resources and attention. At home, Spain faced increasing economic problems. The cost of maintaining such a vast empire, coupled with the inefficiencies of its financial system, was becoming unsustainable. The reign of King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, marked the beginning of Spain's decline. Despite being a devout Catholic and a staunch defender of the faith, Philip's reign was marked by disastrous financial decisions. His wars with France, England, and the Ottoman Empire drained Spain's resources. In 1565, Spain borrowed heavily to finance the war with the Ottoman Empire, a conflict that would stretch on for decades. Meanwhile, Philip's other wars, such as the Dutch Revolt, further burdened the treasury. To finance his wars, Philip turned to the New World, relying on the flow of gold and silver from the Americas. However, by the late 16th century, the flow of precious metals was slowing. The Spanish crown had overextended itself, and the European economy was changing. New trade routes were opening up, and Spain's grip on global trade was slipping. Portugal, Spain's competitor, had established new routes to India and China, while the English and Dutch were building their own empires. By the 17th century, Spain's military dominance was beginning to wane. The Spanish Armada, once the most formidable fleet in the world, was defeated by the English in 1588. This loss marked a turning point in Spain's military power. At the same time, Spain's economy was beginning to deteriorate. The country's industries were underdeveloped, and the wealth from the colonies was not being reinvested in the country's infrastructure or economy. Spain's agricultural sector was stagnating, and the country was increasingly dependent on foreign imports. The seeds of financial mismanagement. By the early 17th century, Spain was facing a financial crisis of epic proportions. The empire's debt had reached unsustainable levels. The Spanish crown was forced to declare bankruptcy multiple times during this period. In 1607, Philip III, who succeeded his father Philip II, was forced to default on Spain's debt. This default sent shockwaves through Europe's financial markets. Spanish creditors, who had long trusted the Spanish crown, were left with nothing. The default was a sign of the empire's growing instability. Despite the economic turmoil, Spain continued to pursue its imperial ambitions. The crown sought to maintain its empire by any means necessary, including borrowing more money. But the debt was piling up. By the time Philip IV ascended to the throne in 1621, Spain was in dire financial straits. The crown was deeply in debt, and its revenues were dwindling. The Spanish economy, which had once been built on gold and silver, was now being drained by the costs of war and imperial expansion. Philip IV's reign was marked by further military conflicts, including the 30 Years' War and the Franco-Spanish War. These wars stretched Spain's resources to the breaking point. To finance these wars, Philip borrowed heavily from foreign banks, including the infamous Dutch financiers. However, the Spanish economy was no longer able to sustain such extravagant military spending. By the 1640s, Spain was once again on the brink of bankruptcy. The crown defaulted on its debt once again. This time in 1647, this marked the beginning of a new phase in the Spanish Empire's decline. Spain's finances were now in tatters, and the empire was no longer able to compete with the rising powers of Europe. While countries like France and England were investing in new technologies and expanding their economies, Spain remained stuck in the past, relying on outdated financial systems and military strategies. As the 17th century progressed, Spain's financial woes only deepened. The empire, once the richest and most powerful in the world, found itself locked in a downward spiral of debt, military defeat, and economic mismanagement. The crown's inability to reform its finances, combined with the persistent strain of continuous warfare, ensured that Spain's once vibrant empire would eventually collapse under its own weight. The strain of war and the financial collapse by the time Charles II took the throne in 1665, Spain was in a state of decline. Charles II, often called the Bewitched, was an ineffective ruler who was physically frail and mentally weak, which exacerbated Spain's already dire situation. His reign was marked by a series of military defeats and political instability. The empire was engaged in a series of wars, including the War of Spanish Succession, but it was increasingly unable to fund these conflicts due to its shattered economy. Spain's imperial ambitions were no longer sustainable. The vast wealth that had once flowed from its colonies in the Americas had dwindled. The flow of gold and silver from the New World had slowed dramatically, and the costs of maintaining a vast empire and fighting wars on multiple fronts had drained the royal coffers. The financial mismanagement that had begun under Philip II continued under his successors. The Spanish crown relied on borrowing to pay for wars, but the ability to repay those loans was now severely limited. Charles Sier's reign also saw the rise of an internal crisis within Spain. The Spanish economy was heavily dependent on imports, particularly from the colonies. However, the empire was now losing control over its colonies. Other European powers, such as France, England, and the Netherlands, were expanding their influence in the Americas. Spain's colonies were becoming more self-sufficient, and the Spanish crown could no longer rely on them to fund its wars or support its economy. The empire's debts continued to grow, and by the end of the 17th century, Spain had declared bankruptcy again. In 1700, Charles Tichon died without an heir, leaving the throne to Philip V, the grandson of King Louis XV of France. Philip V's accession to the throne marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty and the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain. However, this transition would not solve Spain's deep-rooted economic problems. The War of Spanish Succession and the decline of Spanish power, the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1702, was one of the most significant conflicts of the early 18th century. It was fought between the forces of France, Spain, and their allies against a coalition of European powers, including England, Austria, and the Dutch Republic. The war was triggered by the death of Charles II and the question of who should inherit the Spanish throne. Philip V, the French contender, was supported by the French court, but other European powers feared that a union between France and Spain would upset the balance of power in Europe. Spain's participation in the War of Spanish Succession was a disaster. Despite some initial successes, the war eventually drained Spain's already fragile economy. The country was forced to borrow heavily from other European powers to finance its military campaigns. The war left Spain weakened and in debt, with its territory reduced and its military power diminished. By the time the war ended in 1714, Spain had lost its position as a dominant European power. The Treaty of Utrecht, which concluded the War of Spanish Succession, marked the formal decline of Spanish influence in Europe. Spain was forced to cede significant territories to other European powers, including Gibraltar to Britain, and the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, and Sardinia to Austria. The loss of these territories not only reduced Spain's territorial holdings, but also diminished its ability to generate wealth from trade and resources. The loss of Gibraltar, in particular, was a devastating blow to Spain's naval power and its control over the Mediterranean. Economic stagnation and the long road to collapse as the 18th century progressed. Spain's economic situation continued to deteriorate. The country's agricultural sector was outdated, and its industries were underdeveloped. The empire had failed to modernize its economy, relying on an inefficient feudal system that stifled innovation and growth. Meanwhile, other European powers were embracing the Industrial Revolution, which brought with it new technologies, new industries, and new sources of wealth. Spain, however, remained trapped in the past. The empire's debts were spiraling out of control, and the Spanish crown had to continue borrowing to pay for its ongoing military expenditures. The government was unable to manage its finances effectively, and its tax system remained archaic and corrupt. The treasury was perpetually empty, and the royal government had to resort to borrowing from foreign banks to meet its obligations. In 1725, Spain declared yet another bankruptcy. During the reign of Charles III, so 1759 to 1788, Spain made some efforts at reform, particularly in the areas of finance and industry. Charles III tried to modernize the economy by promoting agriculture, industry, and trade. He also attempted to streamline the tax system and reduce government corruption. However, these efforts were not enough to reverse the long-term decline of the empire. Spain's debt continued to grow, and the country remained dependent on foreign loans to finance its military operations and imperial ambitions. By the late 18th century, Spain was no longer a major player in European geopolitics. The empire had been reduced to a second-tier power, and its once thriving colonies in the Americas were slipping away. The Spanish Empire was no longer able to compete with the rising powers of Britain, France, and the United States. The financial resources that had once fueled Spain's dominance were now depleted, and the empire's military power was in decline. The final blow, the loss of Spain's American colonies, the final blow to the Spanish Empire came in the early 19th century with the loss of its American colonies. The Napoleonic Wars, which began in 1803, had a profound impact on Spain. The country was embroiled in a series of conflicts with France, Britain, and other European powers which weakened Spain both militarily and economically. At the same time, Spain's colonies in the Americas were experiencing a wave of revolutionary movements inspired by the ideas of the French and American revolutions. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as king. This invasion sparked a wave of resistance in Spain, and the country became embroiled in the Peninsular Wars 1808 to 1914 against the French. While Spain was fighting in Europe, its colonies in the Americas saw an opportunity to break free from Spanish rule. Inspired by the independence movements in the United States and France, leaders in Spanish America began to call for independence. Over the next few decades, Spain's colonies in the Americas began to fight for their independence. The wars of independence in Latin America were long and brutal, but by the 1820s, Spain had lost most of its American colonies. The loss of these territories, which had been the empire's primary source of wealth, marked the end of Spain's dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The collapse of the Spanish Empire in the early 19th century had profound consequences, not just for Spain itself, but for the entire Western world. With the loss of its American colonies, Spain's economic, political, and military power were severely diminished. However, the lessons from Spain's decline remain highly relevant today, offering insights into the vulnerabilities of great empires and the consequences of financial mismanagement. The economic fallout of empire loss, the loss of Spain's American colonies, was not just a political blow, but an economic catastrophe. The colonies had been the backbone of Spain's wealth for centuries, providing gold, silver, and other valuable resources that fueled the Spanish economy. With the collapse of its colonial empire, Spain lost its primary source of wealth and trade. The royal treasury, already burdened by centuries of debt, was left in ruins. In the aftermath of the wars for independence, Spain faced a new reality. Its once vast empire was reduced to a few scattered territories in the Caribbean and the Philippines. Without the wealth of its colonies to support its economy, Spain entered a period of stagnation. The country's industrial development lagged far behind other European powers, and its agricultural sector remained inefficient and outdated. In the following decades, Spain struggled to modernize its economy. Reforms were implemented under various rulers, but the nation's ability to compete on the global stage was hampered by its previous excesses. The Spanish government, in an attempt to regain some semblance of control, turned to foreign loans, but this only deepened the country's financial woes. Spain's economy remained reliant on foreign capital, and its ability to raise funds in international markets was severely limited. The national debt continued to grow, and Spain's creditworthiness suffered. The emergence of new powers in the Western Hemisphere, while Spain was reeling from the loss of its colonies, new powers were emerging in the Western Hemisphere. The United States, in particular, saw an opportunity to expand its influence. With its vast natural resources and growing industrial base, the United States was rapidly rising as a global power. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the U.S. had solidified its position as the dominant force in the Americas. It was no longer just a regional power. It was poised to challenge the European empires for global supremacy. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which warned European powers against further colonization in the Americas, set the stage for U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. As Spain's empire crumbled, the United States took advantage of its declining influence. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a pivotal moment. Spain's defeat in the war led to the loss of its last major colonies in the Americas, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. These territories were ceded to the U.S., marking the end of Spain's colonial era and the beginning of a new phase in global geopolitics. The United States, once a former colony itself, had become an imperial power, replacing Spain as the dominant force in the Western Hemisphere. The long-term consequences for Spain's global influence, the consequences of Spain's decline, extended far beyond its lost colonies. The empire's collapse marked the end of Spain's centuries, long role as a major European power. Once a dominant force in Europe and the Americas, Spain was now relegated to the periphery of international politics. Spain's ability to influence global events diminished rapidly. The country was no longer in a position to shape the future of Europe or the Western Hemisphere. Its once vibrant naval fleet was obsolete, and its economy was no longer competitive with the rising industrial powers of Europe and the United States. Spain became a bystander in the great geopolitical struggles of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, Spain did not completely disappear from the global stage. It remained an important cultural force, particularly through its language, literature, and art. The legacy of the Spanish Empire continues to shape much of Latin America, where Spanish remains the dominant language and Spanish cultural traditions persist. The lessons of Spain's decline offers several valuable lessons for modern empires and nations. One of the most important is the danger of financial mismanagement and the unsustainable reliance on debt. Spain's empire relied heavily on borrowing, both from domestic and foreign creditors, to fund its military and imperial ambitions. Over time, this debt became unmanageable, and the financial strain contributed significantly to the empire's downfall. Empires that fail to manage their finances, invest in their infrastructure, and adapt to changing economic conditions are prone to collapse. Spain's failure to modernize its economy, particularly during the Industrial Revolution, left it vulnerable to the rise of new powers. While other nations were embracing industrialization and technological innovation, Spain remained stuck in a feudal, agrarian past. Moreover, Spain's decline illustrates the importance of maintaining economic independence. Relying on foreign loans and credit can leave a nation vulnerable to external pressures and create a situation where its sovereignty is compromised. In Spain's case, the foreign debt and financial control of its economy ultimately undermined its ability to make independent decisions. Finally, the rise of the United States as a global power in the wake of Spain's decline underscores the importance of adapting to global power shifts. Just as Spain was displaced by the United States in the Americas, modern powers must be prepared for new competitors to emerge and disrupt the existing order. The global balance of power is constantly shifting, and nations must be able to adapt if they wish to remain relevant on the world stage. Conclusion: the legacy of Spain's empire, the fall of the Spanish Empire, marked the end of an era, but it also paved the way for new powers to rise. While Spain may no longer be a global superpower, its legacy lives on in the cultures and economies of Latin America, where Spanish influence remains strong. However, the collapse of Spain's empire serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of financial mismanagement, debt dependence, and the failure to modernize. As we look at the modern world, the lessons of Spain's decline remain relevant. Empires that fail to adapt to changing economic conditions, modernize their economies, and manage their finances responsibly will ultimately face the same fate. In the globalized world of the 21st century, economic power is just as important as military strength, and the failure to adapt to economic shifts can spell the end of even the most powerful empires. The decline of the Spanish Empire in the 19th century may seem like a distant historical event, but the lessons from Spain's collapse resonate powerfully in today's global landscape. The processes that contributed to Spain's downfall, financial mismanagement, the over-reliance on debt, and the failure to modernize are issues that continue to plague many modern nations. By examining Spain's collapse in the context of the current world economy, we can see striking parallels and understand how the dynamics of financial control, empire, and dependency still affect contemporary geopolitics. The financial trap of modern empires in the modern world. Much like in Spain's time, many nations find themselves ensnared by debt. The global financial system is built on an intricate web of loans, bonds, and credit. Countries borrow money to finance infrastructure projects, wars, and social programs, just as Spain did. However, much like Spain in the 19th century, many of these nations fail to generate sufficient revenue or growth to repay the debt, and they become reliant on foreign lenders. The parallels between the Spanish Empire and modern-day nations are stark. For example, countries like Greece, Argentina, and even the United States at various points in its history have faced similar crises of national debt. Greece, for instance, faced a severe financial collapse during the European debt crisis of the early 2010s. Much like Spain struggled with unsustainable borrowing in the 19th century, the country became dependent on loans from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to avoid default. But those loans came with high interest rates and austerity measures that squeezed the country's economy. Similarly, the United States, despite being the world's largest economy, has accumulated an astronomical national debt, which raises concerns about its long-term financial health. While the U.S. dollar remains the world's reserve currency and the country is still a global superpower, its growing debt could lead to future economic instability if not addressed properly. The question that arises from these modern parallels is whether nations today are repeating the same mistakes that led to Spain's fall. Are they becoming too dependent on external financing, and are they failing to diversify their economies to create sustainable growth? In many cases, the answer seems to be yes. The rise of China and the new debt trap, one of the most significant developments in the global economy today, is the rise of China. China, with its growing economic might and global influence, is seen by many as the new economic superpower, much as Britain once was. But just like Germany's rise in the 19th century, China's economic expansion poses a direct challenge to existing power structures. A crucial part of China's strategy for global influence is its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, a massive infrastructure and development program aimed at connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa through a network of railways, highways, ports, and energy projects. On the surface, the BRI seems to be an opportunity for developing nations to modernize their infrastructure and boost their economies. However, much like the debts of Spain, the BRI has raised concerns about the long-term implications of such financing. Many critics argue that the BRI is a modern-day debt trap, where China offers loans to developing countries that they cannot realistically repay. In exchange, China secures strategic assets and political influence. Countries like Sri Lanka, Zambia, and the Maldives have found themselves in precarious financial positions after borrowing heavily from China to fund BRI projects. Sri Lanka, for example, had to lease its Hambantota port to China for 99 years after failing to repay its loans, raising fears about China's growing influence over critical infrastructure. China's increasing presence in Africa is another example of this new economic imperialism. African nations, many of which are rich in natural resources, have signed billions of dollars worth of contracts with Chinese companies to build infrastructure. However, the debt burden these countries are taking on could ultimately lead to a situation similar to the one Spain faced in the 19th century, where they are left unable to control their own economic destiny. The resource curse, a legacy of dependency, the concept of the resource curse, is an important part of understanding both the historical and contemporary dynamics of empire and debt. Nations that are rich in natural resources, like oil or minerals, often find themselves at the mercy of global markets and foreign powers, as their wealth can become a tool for external control rather than a source of internal prosperity. In the case of Spain, its wealth from the American colonies was supposed to empower the nation, but it instead fueled inflation, economic instability, and dependency on foreign creditors. This situation mirrors that of many oil-rich countries today. For instance, countries like Venezuela, Nigeria, and Angola, despite being rich in oil, have struggled with economic instability, corruption, and a lack of diversification in their economies. The overwhelming reliance on a single resource has left them vulnerable to the whims of global oil prices and foreign debt. Similarly, nations participating in the Belt and Road Initiative, many of which are rich in minerals or energy resources, may find themselves caught in the same trap that ensnared Spain. While they may receive large loans to fund infrastructure projects, these loans often come with strings attached, and the borrowing nations are left with little control over their own resources or political decisions. A new empire of debt. In the modern world, the nature of empire has changed. No longer do countries need to maintain vast overseas territories or military dominance. Instead, economic power is maintained through debt and financial control. In a way, this creates a new kind of empire, one that doesn't require military occupation or colonial rule. Instead, control is exerted through financial instruments, trade agreements, and debt repayments. This new form of empire is evident in the way that countries like China, the United States, and even the European Union maintain their influence over developing nations. The most powerful countries in the world no longer need to invade or conquer. They simply extend lines of credit, set the terms of repayment, and exert influence through the economic system. The parallels between Spain's downfall and the modern financial systems that dominate the world are striking. In both cases, the central issue is a nation's ability to control its own finances. The loss of economic independence, whether due to colonial exploitation or overwhelming debt, leads to a gradual erosion of sovereignty. The lessons of Spain's decline. What lies ahead as we reflect on Spain's decline and its parallels to modern nations? There are valuable lessons to be learned. Nations that rely too heavily on debt, that fail to diversify their economies, and that do not modernize their infrastructure risk finding themselves in the same position as Spain, financially dependent, vulnerable to external pressures, and ultimately at the mercy of foreign creditors. In today's world, the threat of financial dependence is more relevant than ever. As emerging economies take on more debt, they may find themselves trapped in a cycle of borrowing and repayment, unable to break free from the influence of foreign powers. This cycle can lead to instability, social unrest, and the erosion of sovereignty, as we have seen in both the past and the present. The collapse of Spain's empire was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of a new kind of empire, one where financial control became as powerful as military might. The lessons from Spain's downfall continue to shape the world today, as nations navigate the complex and often dangerous world of global finance. Final thoughts: avoiding the Spanish paradox in the 21st century for modern nations. The key takeaway from Spain's decline is simple: avoid the trap of debt dependency. The global financial system offers opportunities, but it also presents significant risks. Nations must carefully balance borrowing with sustainable economic growth, diversify their economies, and ensure that they maintain control over their own financial futures. In this new era of global finance, the ability to manage debt responsibly and maintain economic independence will determine the success or failure of nations in the 21st century. The fate of the Spanish Empire is a stark reminder of what can happen when a nation loses control of its own economy, and a warning for the world as it faces an increasingly interconnected and financially dependent future.